America lives on borrowed money. That's why the terms debt and deficit get thrown around so much.
Or deficit?
Debt problem.
Now you're mixing up the deficit with the debt.
$19 trillion?
Does anybody even know what a trillion means, right?
Good question. What does it all mean?
You know what it means? It means a lot. That's what it means.
Right. Well, let's first start with our definitions. In a given year, a country will raise money through taxes and spend money on everything that a government spends money on. If it spends more than it takes in, the difference is called a deficit, and the government has to borrow money to pay for it. Now, this leads us to debt, and not just any debt, but the debt. The debt is the total sum a government owes. In other words, a deficit is your dirty dish from last night. The debt is your sink. People love to talk about how huge and how unprecedented the debt is.
The biggest threat to America's future is debt that we're piling on.
The transcendent issue of our era.
President Obama is on course to add more debt than all previous presidents combined.
Specifically, let's talk about the United States, since it has the largest debt. Hooray! America number one! So how big is the debt right now?
Hello, I'm Alexis DePasqua.
I'm Eleni Angelakis.
I'm Megan McBride.
And I'm Billy Tenzin.
And currently, the United States of America is in $21,141,000,000,000
$634,909 in debt.
because the government is always receiving and giving out money. However, the debt and deficit can get mixed up often. The topic can be explained in simple terms, as in, the deficit is what the country accumulates when it loses money in 1 year, and the debt is the accumulation of the deficit that the country needs to pay off to investors and other countries. So, the deficit occurs if the taxes and money collected exceeds the money spent by the government on things like military, Social Security, and innovation. The debt keeps adding up with how much money the country cannot pay off. This has been accumulating since 1835. There was only one point in U.S. history where we paid off the debt, on January 8th, 1835, under President Andrew Jackson.
The debt seems especially high when you look at the trend over time. First, we need to adjust that trend for inflation because dollars today are not the same as dollars in the past. Remember, we try to keep it real around here. Second, we really should be looking at debt as a percent of GDP. Why? Well, suppose I owe $200 and a 6-year-old owes $100. Which of us will have a harder time paying it off? Well, probably the 6-year-old, because even though my actual debt number is larger, I have a job. I have 2 jobs. What's your allowance, you unemployed 6-year-old? In the same way, our GDP grows every year due to population growth and productivity increases, and our ability to sustain debt grows along with our income.
Deficits will probably reach $1 trillion in the current or next fiscal year, almost double what the Congressional Budget Office had projected less than a year ago for 2018. The U.S. debt is now on track to reach $30 trillion over the next decade. That's over 100% of projected GDP, well into the danger zone where investors demand higher rates to buy government debt. And if rates do rise substantially, the U.S. will rival the likes of Italy as one of the world's most debt-ravaged nations.
The OECD, or the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, promotes policies that will improve the economic and well-being of people around the world. In 2015, the annual deficit was estimated at 4.2% of the size of its GDP. By comparison, only the UK, Portugal, Spain, and Greece were found to have a higher percentage.
Norway enjoyed a 6% surplus, and China maintained a deficit less than 0.9% relative to its economy after 9 straight years of surpluses.
The deficit surged to over $1 trillion. In 2011, Congress enacted the Budget Control Act to shrink the shortfall. The BCA actually lowered total discretionary spending by around 10% by 2013. These budget control acts are caps that have hard limitations for government spending over the broad spectrum of categories. That year, Congress mandated the automatic cuts in a measure known as the sequester. Sequestering is holding back an asset in case money in the Treasury until the debt is paid or has lessened to a reasonable amount. But the same year, legislatures backtracked, starting the process that sent discretionary spending on an upward trend.
In effect, the BCA sets caps, mandating that discretionary outlays rise a couple of points a year from a low baseline established by deep cuts between 2011 and 2013. But in 2013 and again in 2015, Congress raised the caps for 2-year periods running from 2013 to 2015 and 2016 to 2017 respectively. Over those 4 years, the limits jumped from 7% to $1.07 trillion in 2017.
In 2018, Congress was required to once again impose the original BCA caps dating from 2011, and the ceiling was $1.065 trillion, required that spending drop 0.4% or over 2% adjusted for inflation.
In 2020, it is predicted that Congress will enact a new 2-year agreement that will start at the higher inflated $1.22 trillion level and add kickers for inflation. The BCA expires at the end of 2021. Brian Riedel, a federal budget expert from Manhattan Institute, says, after that, the most likely outcome is that discretionary spending grows at least as fast as inflation. From that, a new, much higher baseline will come about, according to Fortune's article.
So here is the U.S. federal government debt as a percent of GDP. As you can see, it's risen over the past several years. So is that a bad thing?
Well, there's a couple ways to look at it. First, compare the U.S. to other developed nations. The U.S. has a higher debt to GDP than other countries, but several other countries have a much higher ratio. Some of these are in crisis, like Greece and Italy, but there are also other countries that are stable, like Japan and France, that have much higher levels of debt than the U.S. Second, most economists aren't concerned about the borrowing the U.S. has done already because they're too worried about the borrowing they're going to do. A lot of politicians and pundits have freaked out about this, while economists are focused on this.
All right, what we need to figure out is what's driving those huge deficits in coming decades. Deficits are the difference between federal spending and revenue. So let's look at those as a percent of GDP. The problem isn't a drop-off in tax revenue. What economists are worried about is...
The United States has the highest GDP in the world. They still have one of the largest amounts of debt as a percent of GDP. However, there are several other nations that have a lower GDP than the United States.
America's largest state economy is California, which produced $2.31 trillion of the economic output in 2014, just slightly over Brazil's GDP in the same year of $2.35 trillion in 2014. California also, as a separate country, would have been the 8th largest economy in the world, ahead of Italy at $2.1 trillion, and India at $2.4 trillion, and Russia at $1.86 trillion. California's population is only 38.8 million compared to Brazil's population of 200.4 million, which means California produces the same economic output as Brazil with 81% fewer people. That's the testament to the superior world-class productivity of the American worker.
Currently, some of the worst economies lie in Greece and Italy. Their GDPs are declining rapidly and the unemployment rates are skyrocketing. European authorities have authorized handling 7.5 billion euros or $8.4 billion in bailout aid to Greece, which will allow the country to keep paying its bills in the coming months. It has also won additional pledges of debt relief, helping to ease concerns about another crisis in Greece at a time when Europe is dealing with an influx of migrants and continuing terrorist attacks.
In the European Union, most real decision-making power, particularly on matters involving politically delicate things like money and migrants, rests with the 28 national governments, each one beholden to its voters and taxpayers.
Italy's banks struggle with bad loans, and the state itself is saddled with massive debt. But the voters don't seem to care, and the finance minister is demonstratively relaxed about it all.
Okay, so we know how much debt we're in, and we know some experts' opinions on it. So right now, we know that the best way to get rid of our debt in America is by raising taxes.
Hold on. There is no need to raise taxes and have the American people struggle even more than they already do. We can lower the national debt by raising the GDP.
Are you sure?
Mm-hmm.
We'll talk about it. That problem to be fixed is by increasing taxes for earners in the top 1%.
If we raise taxes during a period of high economic growth, this will not harm the consumer spending and therefore keeping the economy thriving.
In the long term, reasonable tax increases will do less damage to the economy than cuts in the government investment.
Along with raising taxes, cutting government spending would also be beneficial to lowering the U.S. debt. This method was used by President Dwight D. Eisenhower, and he managed to decrease the national government debt in 1956 and 1957.
Tax cuts from the Bush era did not bring growth that he believed it would. Money and further a downward spiral into more debt.
Our mandatory spending needed for a government to function, exceeds $2 trillion, and this is where our taxes need to come in and support the necessary expenses that our country has.
The main aspect that will decrease the debt is by raising the GDP, not taxes. The GDP will be raised by lowering taxes and stabling the money supply.
If the GDP expands, then the tax revenue will go up, and the government will have more money to spend, narrowing the deficit and lowering our debt.
If we raise taxes now, then it will benefit the baby boomers. But after the baby boomers are gone, then taxes will be too high and they would be split among the small amount of people in Social Security.
Taxes is going to get tight for a little bit, until the baby boomers are gone. But we need to save as a generation now so that we can support ourselves in our old age, because the baby boomers will have used up all the money before we can benefit from it in Social Security.
The cost of living is going up and people need to feed their own families. Taxes are high enough as it is, but to increase them would make the average living harder for some people.
Instead of raising taxes, we should just need to allocate the resources more efficiently. If for a specific year we are doing a new educational program, for instance, or a bill gets passed in a specific region, that tax dollars should go to that and allow them to get more money for that specific program. That's not saying that if education gets a bill, then defense gets nothing. Everything should have a minimum requirement.
Thank you, everybody, very much. And these are the people right behind me. They've worked so long, so hard. It's been an amazing experience, I have to tell you. Hasn't been done in 34 years, but actually really hasn't been done because we broke every record. It's the largest, I always say the most massive, but it's the largest tax cut in the history of our country. And reform, but tax cut. Really something special. And I noticed this just came out 2 minutes ago. They handed it to me. AT&T plans to increase U.S. capital spending $1 billion and provide $1,000 special bonus to more than 200,000 U.S. employees, and that's because of what we did. So that's pretty good. That's pretty good. And I have a whole list of accomplishments that the group behind me have done in terms of this administration and this Congress, but you've heard it before. Records all over the place, and that will continue, and then some because of what we did. But $3.2 trillion, just think of it, in tax cuts for American families, including doubling the standard deduction and doubling the child tax credit. The typical family of four earning $75,000 will see an income tax cut of more than $2,000. They're going to have $2,000, and that's, in my opinion, going to be less than the average. You're going to have a lot more than that. One thing very important for the farmers, the great farmers and the great small business owners that were forced to sell their businesses at bargain basement numbers, we have provided, for the most part, estate taxes wiped out so they can keep their farms in the family, and that to me is a very big factor, very big. This is This is going to mean companies are going to be coming back. You know, I campaigned on the fact that we're not going to lose our companies anymore. They're going to stay in our country, and they're going to stay in our country. And you've been seeing what's been happening even at this prospect. But they have tremendous enthusiasm right now in this country, and we have companies pouring back into our country, and that means jobs, and it means really the formation of new, young, beautiful, strong companies. So that's going to be very, very important. The pass-throughs you know all about, and the small businesses are going to be big beneficiaries. We are going to bring at least $4 trillion back into this country, money that was frozen overseas and in parts and worlds, and some of them don't even like us, and they had the money. Well, they're not going to have the money long. And so it's really, I guess it's very simple.